there's other things too that are really problematic that I don't think any other libertarian candidates are addressing at all, and that is the ESG. ESG is an extra governmental, parallel governmental coercion regime. Okay, that is forcing producers into producing certain things and eliminating other things, and it controls how they produce everything and what, in fact, they're able to produce, and therefore what we're able to buy. So it's kind of a cartel scheme that drives competitors out of business. That's what's in it for them. And it controls consumption to a great degree. So they're going to be basically not producing things that you want. And this is a complete distortion of the market, of course. And it is, it is a beast because it is a monopoly scheme. First of all, this is a monopoly scheme. So it's about eliminating laissez-faire. I mean, Klaus Schwab has said this directly in his books, that he hates what he calls neoliberalism. But what he means by it, after he defines it, is the free market itself. And they want to eliminate the free market. And ESG is a means by which they're doing this. ESG, of course, stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance Index. And part of the ESG is the S. And that's rating companies and eventually individuals on their social score. And that is how well they abide by these woke dictates. And this is being absorbed into the state. Biden's first veto in office was vetoing a bill that would have prohibited ESG investing of pension funds. So that's the only veto that he's issued. And that's because they want this ESG. And of course, this is about total control as well. This is about controlling the company's behaviors and individuals' behaviors. It is about restricting everything that we can do. And the social credit score comes on top of that. So, and the other part of the ESG is G, and that is really about how much these companies and you as an individual comply with governmental dictates.
Right. Right. And it is a fascinating, which I actually was just learning about. In fact, Vivek Ramaswamy was one of the ones who was talking a lot about this, but that this is one of the ways that the politicians kind of manipulate these standards, is that it's like what Jimmy Hoffa, this used to be how he got so in with the mob and got powerful, was like, and it wasn't like he had so much money, but he was the head of the union. And so he could control where all their pensions were invested. So it was this enormous amount of money that he could then decide where that money is going to be funneled. And then from that, you get enormous power. And what we have now is these, the public unions. So, so with these politicians have complete control of all of the pensions of every public worker within their state, which is, the only people who still have pensions in today's society pretty much are the ones who work for the government, who get it from the taxpayers. So now they can say, we'll give all of this money to BlackRock, but only if you keep up with these ESG scores, only if you invest the money this way. So it is the politicians driving these shadowy private companies that then enforce all of this on the entire country. It's really, when people wonder, they're kind of like, wait a minute, I understand that there's this mentality that swept college campuses where they've decided the new fad is like that there's no such thing as gender. Like, okay, you can kind of understand where 19-year-olds are getting into this crazy stuff. Right. Particularly 19-year-olds who grew up without families and have been medicated their entire life. But that's here nor there. But you're like, why did every single corporation in America decide there's no such thing as gender? These aren't 19-year-olds. These aren't 19-year-olds who are being kind of like swept away by some argument a liberal arts professor is making. What's going on? And this is what's actually going on here, that the government is directing these shadowy corporations to insist that they all push this. This is why it's happening.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Jimmy Hoffa is Larry Fink, in effect. Larry Fink of BlackRock is pushing all this through the markets. He says basically he will starve your company of capital investments if you do not abide. And why is that important to us? It's obviously a distortion of the market, but it's about total control over all spending and control over what we can consume, control over all production, and it's a monopoly scheme. As I said, it's a way of getting rid of competitors, and that's what's in it for them. So I argue in the book, you got to divest from ESG. It's feeding the beast. So find a way to divest if you have investments in these portfolios that have any stocks at all. And I know I'm speaking to a sliver of people, but also your banks are involved in this. So you've got to pull your funds out of banks that are promoting ESG. And Brian Moynihan of Bank of America has said, if a company or a person doesn't meet the ESG bar, you will not get a loan. You will not get money. You'll be starved on the vine.
Yeah. And right. And as you said, from like a libertarian point of view, like this is not a product of anything resembling a laissez-faire market. This is not, Bank of America is not just some private company. You know, they're a member of the Federal Reserve. That's
exactly.
This is our own government who's doing this to us.
And that's another thing I wanted to mention.
Sure.
Like what we're seeing too is what is the state today? It's not just the government at this point. We're looking at the absorption of corporations into the state. They have become state apparatuses, or what I call governmentalities. We can obviously see this with big tech. We see through the Twitter files, but I knew this back in 2018 when I wrote Google Archipelago, that big tech is a state apparatus. It is being absorbed by the state and is being used for state functions, and largely repressive functions of censorship, propaganda, and narrative control. So, we have to look at the state in a broader perspective than we've been used to as libertarians, and start to see the state as the regime, inclusive of these governmentalities. And big pharma is obviously a governmentality. It's also been absorbed into the state. Look how they got monopoly and liability, lifted liability for these vaccines, and monopoly over them through patents. And then what did the state get in exchange for granting these limited monopolies and this effective, limited liability? They got increased powers of coercion over the population. And the same goes, of course, for the military industrial complex. This was the obvious one for many, many years. What do they get from it? They get money, of course, but the state then expands its power. And it also represses, the domestic population. It cows them into submission, and it spies on them. So this is how we have to reconfigure our understanding about what the state is and what it is we're opposing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like because there are libertarians. Also, one of the issues is that this stuff is a little bit complex. Yeah. And so it's like you have to do a little bit of work to actually understand it. But to think of for a libertarian to think of BlackRock or Vanguard or one of these companies as like, well, that's just a private company, and hey, if they choose to invest their money this way, they have a right to invest their money. Right. It's on the level of saying like, hey, Raytheon's just a private company, and if they want to make their missiles this way, then that's how they make their missiles. It's like, no, that's not at all. They're in the web of state power. They exist because of state power. They exist to perpetuate state power, and they benefit from it. And they're benefiting and perpetuating everything we're against. And so we oppose them. That's the libertarian message. Yeah. Get that through your head, libertarians.
That's why you can't say about social media, well, it's their platform. It's a private company. They can censor whoever they want. Well, they're censoring them at the behest of the state. They're censoring them at the behest of the FBI and other agencies, Department of Homeland Security. We saw this with the Twitter files. We see this in Missouri versus Biden. It's very clear that these companies are operating at the state's direction.
Yes, 100%. And then the other thing that happens here, and this is another reason why I think it's great that you're in the race, is that there will be some Republicans, let's say, who will come out and say, I'm against all of this stuff. I oppose wokeism and I oppose censorship on social media. But their solutions then
is censorship.
Always right. It's always some next government program, some next government plan, which is and it's frustrating. But as I try to say often to my right-wing listeners, that look, when the Department of Homeland Security was created, when the Patriot Act was passed, it was libertarians who were telling the conservatives, do not support this. This is going to be a disaster. It's going to be used against you. And now look at it. Who's the war on terrorism on now? It's on the same right-wingers who supported George W. Bush in creating all of this stuff.
Exactly, domestic terrorists, yeah.
Right. So you would think we would have gained a little bit of credibility at this point when they go, well, what we need to do is nationalize Twitter, and go, no, do not do that. This is good. This is going to, it can still get so much worse than it is now for you. And so there's got to be kind of someone who can say, no, listen, we oppose all of this stuff, but we also recognize that the problem here is government intervention into the market. And the solution is to get government out of this entirely.
And absolutely. Like you have DeSantis in Florida, he's a big cultural warrior, but his solution to, infiltration of wokeness in the academy, including, in the curriculum with CRT and LGBTQIA ideology, is to ban it, which is just absolutely insane. That's exactly what they want you to do, because then they can point to you and say, you're the authoritarian. And secondly, what we need is competition in this marketplace, competition in all of the areas of ideas and so forth. So the answer is always competition. I think that if what it is, it's these ideologies, these forms of thinking have been established as monopolies. They've been established as monopolies through state funding. So what we need to do is end the state funding, end the monopolization of ideas, end the monopolization of the market, and then establish liberty and competition.
Yeah, 100%. All right, I want to switch gears here because I want to talk about a few other issues that are very important. I wanted to talk a bit about immigration. This is another thing that I'm really glad that you are where you are on this issue. I think there are some libertarians who still support the notion of open borders. As I've been saying for years, this is not the correct libertarian position. It's just not, that's not actually the correct understanding of libertarianism. Right. And perhaps more important than that, for a presidential campaign, it is it's just a deal breaker. It's a killer.
It's a death sentence.
Yes, as soon as you say that, whatever anybody, the truth is that probably even amongst the Democratic Party base, open, but none of them come out and say I'm for open borders, because it's an enormously unpopular position. But for a libertarian to say it, no one's going to listen to any of the rest of the great things you have to say if you're for that. It's also not the correct position. But I wonder if you could explain where you're at on the topic of immigration, and also kind of how that seems to also be a huge component of what the ruling elite wish to push on us.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so go ahead.
It's a huge part of it. I'll start with the latter point, that the elite want to have open borders because they're looking to dissolve national sovereignty, and they're not doing that for good reasons, like getting rid of the state. No, they want global statism, which is the ultimate enemy, because global statism can be utterly totalitarian, and there's no escape when you have a global state, when you have a one world system. So I'm talking about localization all the way down. So